August 1941. The fields west of Odessa. The air is thick with the scent of sunflowers, dust, and the metallic tang of expended gunpowder. Crouched in a hastily dug trench, a young woman adjusts the worn leather strap of her Mosin-Nagant 90-130 rifle. Her world has shrunk to the 3.5 power magnification of its scope. Through the lens, the Ukrainian steppe is a canvas of shimmering heat and shadow. And in that canvas, enemy soldiers move like ghosts, believing they are unseen. But they are not. For the woman watching them, this is not a battlefield. It is a hunting ground. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and she is about to make her first kill. Just months earlier, her hands held not a rifle, but the fragile, yellowed pages of history. At Kyiv State University, Lyudmila was a fourth-year student, her life measured in lectures, library archives, and the quiet pursuit of knowledge. She was sharp, determined, with a future mapped out. She would become a scholar, a teacher. Her passion was the 17th-century Ukrainian leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a figure of rebellion and nation-building. She understood the sweep of empires, the clash of armies, but only as text on a page. Her world was one of debate and theory, a civilized space built on the assumption of a future. That assumption was shattered at dawn on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers stormed across the Soviet border. The radio, once a source of music and news, became a herald of catastrophe, its broadcasts crackling with a new, terrifying urgency. The war was not a distant rumor. It was a physical presence, a sound wave of bombers roaring over the ancient spires of Kyiv. For Lyudmila, history was no longer a subject to be studied. It was an event to be survived. She walked straight to the recruiting office. The lines were long, filled with men buoyed by a mix of patriotic fervor and grim determination. When her turn came, the officer looked past her. He saw a 24-year-old woman, tall, dark-haired, with an intensity in her eyes, but a woman nonetheless. He pointed her toward the nursing corps. "We need nurses," he said, his tone dismissive. "Bandage rollers." Lyudmila refused. It was not a plea, it was a statement of fact. She would not be a nurse. She would be a soldier. She would fight. The officer was skeptical, but Lyudmila produced her credentials. In the years before the war, she had, like many Soviet youths, participated in WWII, a paramilitary sports society. While working at the Kyiv Arsenal factory, she had joined a shooting club, discovering a natural, almost unnerving talent for marksmanship. She was a Voroshilov sharpshooter, an official designation of excellence. Still, the men were unconvinced. They handed her a rifle, pointed to two distant figures, collaborators working for the Romanians, and gave her a simple, brutal addition. It was a test they did not expect her to pass. Lyudmila raised the rifle, the heavy wooden stock strange and yet familiar. She controlled her breathing, just as she had been taught. She squeezed the trigger, and then again. The two figures fell. The audition was over. There were no more arguments. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was assigned to the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division. The transition was jarring. The tailored clothes of a university student were replaced by a rough, ill-fitting soldier's tunic. The academic quiet of the library was lost to the cacophony of the barracks and the drill yard. But it was on the front line, in the defense of Odessa, that the true nature of war revealed itself. This was not a test range. The targets shot back. Her first day in combat was a crucible of terror. The noise, the confusion, the sheer, paralyzing fear. She saw a young comrade, a boy she had shared bread with just hours before, cut down by enemy fire. That moment forged something new in her. The hesitation, the intellectual distance, it all burned away. Her commanding officer had told her the men in her sights were not human. They were fascists, intruders, and it was her job to exterminate them. Lyudmila took her position. Through her scope, she found her targets. Two Romanian soldiers standing by a tree. Her hands were steady. Her breath was a whisper, but her finger wouldn't move. The academic in her, the student who cherished human history, was still there. She could not bring herself to extinguish a life. Then the world erupted. A German mortar shell landed near her position. The soldier next to her, a young, cheerful man, was killed instantly. The force of the blast threw her against the trench wall. When the ringing in her ears subsided, she looked at what was left of her friend. The girl from Kyiv was gone. In her place was a sniper. She raised her rifle, found the enemy soldiers again, and this time, she did not hesitate. 2 shots and 2 confirmed kills. The legend of Lyudmila Pavlichenko had begun, written in blood and soil on the approaches to Odessa. The 2 kills were a grim baptism. In the days that followed, the defense of Odessa devolved into a brutal, grinding siege. The vibrant port city, once a jewel on the Black Sea, became a meat grinder. The war for Lyudmila was not one of grand charges or sweeping tank battles. It was a war of inches, fought from waterlogged trenches and the rubble of bombed-out buildings. It was a war of stillness. Her days took on a stark, disciplined rhythm. Before the sun breached the horizon, she would slip out of the Soviet lines, crawling on her belly through the mud and debris of no man's land. She would find her nest, a hollowed-out log, a shell crater, the attic of a ruined farmhouse, and there she would wait. For hours, sometimes for a whole day. Time became an abstract concept, measured only by the slow creep of shadows and the gnawing ache of hunger in her stomach. Her world was the view through her pea's scope, a narrow, magnified slice of enemy territory. Her mind, once trained to sift through historical texts, was now rewired to read the landscape for a misplaced shadow, a glint of metal, a flicker of movement that betrayed a human life. And one by one, she erased them. A soldier lighting a cigarette, an officer studying a map, a machine gunner pausing to wipe his brow. Each shot was a cold, calculated equation of distance, wind, and timing. There was no anger in the act, no passion. There was only the quiet focus of a master craftsman. Her tally grew. 10, 50, 100. Among the German and Romanian ranks, a whisper began. A ghost was haunting the lines, a phantom with a rifle who could strike from nowhere and then vanish. They couldn't know who it was, only that their losses were mounting in a way that defied the normal attrition of combat. They began to fear the open ground, to dread the moment of carelessness. They called this unseen enemy Die Dame Todd, Lady Death. The nickname, born of fear, would become her title. But to hunt, one must also be willing to be hunted. The Germans, realizing they were being targeted by a highly effective sniper, dispatched their own specialists. The hunter became the prey. For Lyudmila, this was the ultimate test. A duel with an enemy sniper was not a battle of firepower. It was a contest of intellect, of patience, of psychological endurance. It was chess played with bullets. One such duel lasted 3 days. She knew he was out there. She felt his presence, an invisible pressure on the landscape. He was a professional, clever and patient. For 72 hours, they remained locked in a silent standoff, each waiting for the other to make a single, fatal mistake. The sun beat down. The cold of the night seeped into their bones. They were statues of flesh and blood, willing themselves into the very earth around them. On the 3rd day, Lyudmila saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shift beneath a pile of rubble. He was adjusting his position. She remained perfectly still, her rifle already aimed. She watched for hours, waiting. Then a brief, careless movement. A glint of sunlight off his scope lens. It was the only invitation she needed. Her shot was instantaneous. The duel was over. When she later crawled to his position under the cover of darkness, she found his logbook. He had taken out over 400 Allied soldiers on the Western Front before being transferred east to hunt her. By October, after 73 days of relentless fighting, the defense of Odessa had become untenable. The order came to evacuate. The Red Army would fall back to the heavily fortified naval base of Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula. As the last Soviet ships slipped away from the burning city, leaving it to the Axis forces, Lyudmila Pavlichenko carried with her a new tally, 187 confirmed kills. The fight for Sevastopol would be even more brutal. Pinned against the sea, the city was a fortress, a bastion the Soviets were determined to hold at all costs. For the next 8 months, Lyudmila continued her deadly work. The terrain was different, rocky hills and fortified bunkers instead of open fields, but her methods were the same. Here, her reputation preceded her. She was no longer just a soldier, she was a symbol. Soviet commanders, recognizing her value, began pairing her with other snipers, having her train novices in the art of concealment and marksmanship. Her calm, methodical approach in the face of unimaginable pressure was a lesson in itself. In Sevastopol, she added another 122 kills to her record. Among them were some of the 36 enemy snipers she would ultimately defeat. Each one was a life-or-death struggle, a testament to her supreme skill and unyielding nerve. She was wounded 4 times during the war, struck by shrapnel from artillery and mortar fire. Each time, she refused to be evacuated, returning to the front as soon as she could hold her rifle steady. But in June of 1942, during the final, desperate days of the siege, her luck ran out. A mortar shell exploded near her face, driving fragments of metal into her skull. This time, the wound was too severe. She was pulled from the fighting, against her will, and evacuated by submarine just before the city fell. Her war on the front line was over. She left the ruins of Sevastopol with 309 confirmed kills, a number that would echo into history. The submarine that carried Lyudmila away from the smoking ruins of Sevastopol delivered her to a world she no longer recognized. Her wounds were tended to, but the shrapnel in her head was a permanent, painful reminder of the war she had been forced to leave behind. The sounds of combat were replaced by the sterile quiet of a hospital, then by the murmurs of high-level meetings. The Kremlin had a new mission for her, one that required not a rifle, but a voice. The Soviet Union was bleeding. The German war machine, though blunted at the gates of Moscow, was still grinding relentlessly into the heartland. Millions of soldiers and civilians were dead. The nation desperately needed its Western allies, Britain and the United States, to open a second front in Europe, to draw German divisions away from the east. But the Allies were hesitant, their own resources stretched thin, their leaders cautious. Stalin needed a new kind of weapon, an instrument of persuasion. He needed a hero. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the student-turned-sniper with 309 kills, was the perfect candidate. She was a woman, a fact that would be both a curiosity and a powerful symbol in the West. She was a decorated soldier, a hero of the Soviet Union. She was articulate, intelligent, and her story was undeniably compelling. And so, in late 1942, Major Pavlichenko was dispatched as part of a Soviet youth delegation to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. Her objective, to convince the Allies to fight. When she arrived in Washington, D.C., she was met with a bewildering reception. American journalists, accustomed to pin-up girls and Hollywood starlets, didn't know what to make of this somber young woman in her olive-green military tunic. They asked her about her makeup routine. They questioned if Russian women were allowed to wear lipstick at the front. They were fascinated by the length of her uniform skirt, which they deemed dowdy and unfashionable. To Lyudmila, who had crawled through mud and blood, who had watched friends die, who had lived for a year with the constant threat of a violent death, the questions were absurd. They were trivial, insulting. She was a soldier who had killed 309 fascists. What did fashion have to do with it? Her frustration was palpable. At press conferences, her answers grew sharp, her patience thin. "I wear my uniform with honor," she stated coolly. "It has the Order of Lenin on it. It has been covered with blood in battle. It is plain to see that with American women, what is important is whether they wear silk underwear under their uniforms. What the uniform stands for, they have yet to learn." But among the sea of bewildered faces, one person understood. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. She saw past the uniform and the stern demeanor. She saw the weight of the war in Lyudmila's eyes. Ignoring protocol, Mrs. Roosevelt took the young Soviet sniper under her wing, inviting her to tour the country with her. A remarkable, unlikely friendship began to form between the patrician American First Lady and the working-class Ukrainian soldier. They traveled together, spoke at rallies, and in their private moments they talked. Eleanor listened as Lyudmila spoke of the devastation in her homeland, of the sheer scale of the suffering. And Lyudmila, in turn, began to understand the complex political landscape of her mission. It was in Chicago, standing before a large, expectant crowd, that Lyudmila finally found her voice. She had grown weary of the patronizing questions, of being treated as a novelty. She set aside the prepared speeches. She looked out at the faces of the men in the audience and spoke from the heart, her voice ringing with an authority forged in battle. "Gentlemen," she began, her tone quiet but firm, "I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" A stunned silence fell over the hall. Then applause erupted. The line cut through the political rhetoric and the polite diplomacy. It was raw, accusatory, and undeniably true. The message was clear. While Americans debated, Soviets died. The moment was a turning point. The press began to see her not as a curiosity, but as what she was, a hardened veteran of the most brutal war in history. Her words were printed in newspapers across the country. She became a sensation, Lady Death personified. Her tour continued, taking her to Canada and then to Britain, where she was welcomed at the armaments factories of Coventry, a city that knew well the devastation of German bombs. She met with other female soldiers, the women of Britain's anti-aircraft batteries, and found a camaraderie that transcended language and ideology. She had become a potent symbol, a living embodiment of total war, a challenge to the comfortable distance the West still felt from the charnel house of the Eastern Front. She never knew if her tour was the deciding factor, but less than 2 years later, on June 6, 1944, the Allies would land in Normandy. The Second Front was finally open. Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union a national hero. She was promoted to major, and though her combat injuries prevented a return to the front, she was not finished with the war. She spent the remaining years as an instructor, training a new generation of Soviet snipers. She passed on the hard-won lessons of Odessa and Sevastopol, the arts of camouflage, patience, and marksmanship. The knowledge she had gained through a lens, she now imparted in a classroom. She had come full circle, from a student of history to a maker of it, and now, finally, a teacher once more. The war would end, but for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, its echoes would last a lifetime.